Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources, extract the most important nuggets, and build you the essential understanding you need.
Today we're challenging a fundamental misconception, I think.
Yeah.
The idea that history is just this fixed, settled record of the past.
Right, like it's a book on a shelf that never changes.
Exactly. When
Yeah.
in reality, history is, well, it's a dynamic and fiercely contested argument. It's shaped almost entirely by who is doing the writing and, maybe more importantly, what political or social agenda they are trying to advance.
Exactly. And our mission in this deep dive is to tackle the historiography of ancient India. So we're actually setting aside the specific chronology of the Mauryas or the Guptas for a moment.
Hmm.
Instead, we're focusing on the story of how that history, the history that you read in textbooks today, has been constructed, distorted, and, aggressively reconstructed over the past 2.5 centuries.
We've identified four major and often conflicting approaches that have really defined this historical field. You have the initial colonial perspective,
The starting point for everything, really.
then the intense nationalist reaction that followed it. After that, a more academic move toward what we call non-political history, and finally the contemporary challenge posed by the communal approach.
This material is absolutely vital because it demonstrates how history transforms into a tool. It helps us understand not just the alleged facts of ancient India, but the political, administrative, and social agendas that have consistently driven historical research from the 18th century right up to the present day.
Understanding these constantly shifting lenses is, I think, the only way to critically assess any historical claim you encounter today. You really need to know the motivations, which are often hidden or implicit behind the narrative you're reading.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We began at the very starting line of modern Indian historical research, and here's a bit of a surprise. It wasn't born out of some lofty academic curiosity.
Not at all. It was a cold, hard requirement for running an empire.
Let's get into that.
We have to anchor the genesis of modern Indian historical research to the second half of the 18th century. Specifically, the date to remember is 1765.
Why that year in particular?
Because that's the moment when Bengal and Bihar transitioned completely under the administrative control of the British East India Company. Suddenly, the company wasn't just a trading body anymore.
They were the government.
They were the government. They were collecting revenue and administering justice for this vast and, to them, totally alien population.
And that, you can imagine, created a massive, immediate, and very practical problem. They're the rulers, but they understood they couldn't just impose English common law onto Hindu and Muslim populations. That would be chaos.
It would have been a disaster. They needed a legal framework that respected, or at least appeared to respect, the existing traditional laws. This was all about maintaining stability.
So the most acute difficulty they faced, according to the sources, was in a very specific area.
Yes, it was administering the Hindu law of inheritance. British civil servants had absolutely no access to the foundational texts, the complex rules governing property, succession. It was all entirely alien to them.
It was a critical knowledge gap.
A huge one. And they had to fill it out of pure administrative necessity. This wasn't intellectual exploration or some noble desire to preserve ancient culture. It was about function.
So the very first systematic modern academic endeavor was, in effect, a legal project. It was driven by tax collection and property disputes.
Precisely. And this immediate administrative need led directly to a key translation project, which culminated in the year 1776.
And what were they translating?
They translated Manu Smriti, which was considered by many to be the authoritative Hindu law book. It governs socio-religious duties, civil rules, everything.
I see. And it was published in English.
Yes, as a code of Gentoo laws. That act, driven purely by the functionality of the new colonial bureaucracy, officially marks the beginning of modern historical inquiry into these ancient texts.
And this process immediately institutionalized the study, right? It wasn't just a one-off project.
Right. British judges found themselves completely dependent on local knowledge. They had to work directly with Pandits for Hindu civil law and with Maulvis for Muslim law. They were building a system on the fly.
This dependency then created a demand for deeper, broader scholarly work.
It had to. It was practical, it was necessary, and it laid the foundation for everything that followed. It really defined the terms of historical discourse for the next century.
And here's where things get really interesting. Because this administrative necessity, this legal problem, it unexpectedly blossomed into something much bigger. full-blown global Indological studies.
And that shift was driven by a single visionary civil servant who was, he was far more than a typical bureaucrat.
You're talking about Sir William Jones?
Sir William Jones, a remarkable polymath who lived from 1746 to 1794. His efforts, and those of his contemporaries, culminated in the establishment of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in Calcutta in 1784.
And the society wasn't just a gentleman's club. It had a serious mission.
A very serious mission. It was designed to gather knowledge about the customs, the laws, the arts, the sciences, the history of Asia, with a heavy initial focus on India, for obvious reasons.
But Jones wasn't just compiling existing knowledge. He made this massive global connection that just shattered European perceptions at the time.
He did. The sources are really clear on this. Jones was the first scholar to seriously suggest that Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek all belong to the same family of languages.
That must have been an absolute revelation.
Think about it. It suddenly linked India's ancient intellectual traditions directly to the European classical tradition. It suggested a shared, deep past that no one had suspected.
That's a thunderbolt for the rest of Europe, not just Britain.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Suddenly, countries like Germany, France, Russia, they were all heavily enthused. They started funding their own extensive Indological studies, keen to trace the roots of this newly discovered linguistic connection.
And this burst of, let's call it, academic infrastructure development, it was swift.
Very swift. We see rapid translation efforts. Charles Wilkins translated the Bhagavad Gita in 1785, which brought one of Hinduism's most profound philosophical texts to the West for the first time.
And Jones himself followed that up.
He did. He translated the acclaimed Sanskrit play Abhisnana Shakuntalam in 1789, and the movement quickly created a global academic infrastructure dedicated just to studying India.
So you get the Bombay Asiatic Society in 1804.
The Asiatic Society of Great Britain in London in 1823.
And, maybe most significantly, the establishment of Sanskrit chairs, actual professorships, across the UK and Europe throughout the first half of the 19th century.
It's an incredible trajectory. The colonial requirement for law quickly spiraled into a global academic movement for language and culture.
Okay, so let's move to the next major pivot point, which happens after 1857. Here, the focus shifts dramatically from merely administering the law to justifying and maintaining total control over a vast and now very restive population.
The revolt of 1857 was a seismic shock to the British system. It forced them to realize that their superficial understanding of India was completely insufficient.
It wasn't enough to just know the laws.
Not anymore. To maintain despotic control over an alien population, they realized they needed a deeper, more intimate and systematic knowledge of Indian manners, social systems, and crucially, their psychological vulnerabilities.
This is where the German-born scholar F. Max Mueller enters the picture. He lived from 1823 to 1902.
And he gave the greatest impetus to these studies. He often acted as this bridge between the administrative needs of the British government and the academic excitement brewing in Europe.
And at the same time, you had Christian missionaries intensifying their efforts.
Right. They believed that converting the Hindu population would have fundamentally strengthened and stabilized the empire. So you have these two forces, academic and religious, working towards a similar goal of deeper understanding for the sake of control.
Mueller's massive contribution was editing the Sacred Books of the East series. This was a truly monumental effort.
Unbelievable. It resulted in 50 volumes, some of them with multiple parts. It was predominantly ancient Indian texts, though it also included some texts from China and Iran. The goal was wholesale translation of ancient scriptures to understand and implicitly to categorize and control the very foundation of Indian thought.
And the sources are clear that through the introductions, the notes, the analysis that accompanied these monumental translations, Mueller and other influential Western scholars established a set of core assumptions.
Yes, and these generalizations systematically served to denigrate Indian capabilities and achievements. This is where they laid the intellectual groundwork for imperial justification.
This is where history becomes a clear tool of propaganda.
It's the ideological justification for the empire, plain and simple. It focused on three major areas, all designed to portray India as fundamentally incapable of self-governance or material progress.
Let's break those down. The first claim was a fundamental one, the alleged lack of chronology or a sense of history.
The colonial narrative argued that ancient Indians were so focused on cyclical time and, eternal truths that they lacked the rigid, linear historical sense that you find in the West or in China.
And they presented this as a national characteristic, a flaw in the Indian mind.
Yes, Now, while it's true that ancient Indian literature prioritized philosophical and cosmological narratives over systematic political annals, that's not the whole story.
The sources also point out a counter-argument.
They do. Important early events were dated relative to pivotal moments, like the death of Gautama Buddha. But the colonial narrative systematically overstated this deficiency to argue that a people without a sense of their own history could not possibly plan for their future.
A convenient argument. Okay, generalization two. This one dealt with philosophy and material engagement.
The narrative they built was that Indians were hopelessly engrossed in spiritualism and the next world. This implied they felt absolutely no concern for the problems of this world material reality: economics, social systems, governance.
That's a very subtle but powerful critique.
It's incredibly powerful. It excused the British government from having to promote material progress or self-rule because, hey, the Indians supposedly didn't desire it anyway. It depicted India as a land of philosophical dreamers, incapable of practical administration.
And the third, and perhaps the most politically damaging, generalization addressed political ability.
This was the knockout punch, really. The assertion that Indians had neither a sense of nationhood nor any prior form of self-government, that they were accustomed only to despotic rule. The implication was that unified representative government was an entirely alien concept.
So no history, no material focus, and no political capacity. These three claims were then codified. They were put into a single, systematic, official historical text.
By Vincent Arthur Smith. He lived from 1843 to 1920, and he was a loyal member of the Indian Civil Service. His perspective was explicitly and unapologetically pro-imperialist.
And his book, Early History of India, published in 1804, became the first systematic survey of ancient India.
And it served as the official textbook for colonial administration and for Indian universities for nearly 50 years. The book gave primacy to political history, but the bias was just crystal clear.
How so? What was the focus?
He heavily emphasized the role of foreigners. The narrative was that any moments of glory or decisive political action came from external influence.
And we can see the measure of this bias in one astonishing fact from the sources.
That Alexander's invasion, which was a relatively brief military campaign in the grand scheme of things, accounted for nearly 1/3 of his entire book.
1/3? That's incredible.
It shows the emphasis. The focus was on external forces shaping the subcontinent, not on internal dynamism.
And he didn't mince words about India's political tradition either. He used his historical framework to make a definitive political statement about India's past, which then directly determined his view of its future.
He did. He asserted, and this is a direct quote, "Autocracy is substantially the only form of government with which the historian of India is concerned."
Wow. That one quote is the ultimate summary of the colonial historical tool.
It says it all. These views justified British despotic rule entirely. If Indians were obsessed with the next world, well, the British had to look after this one. And if they had no past experience of self-rule or nationhood, they couldn't possibly manage their affairs in the present.
So the historical narrative was, in fact, weaponized propaganda designed to perpetuate power and control.
Absolutely. The story of the colonial lens, then, is a perfect illustration of history as an administrative and ideological weapon.
But the moment those distortions were published and taught to a new generation of Western-educated Indian elites, they provoked an immediate and powerful counter-reaction.
As they were bound to.
The colonial historical project was a direct challenge to Indian identity, and you have these Western-educated Indian scholars who are confronted daily with this historical degradation.
They were deeply distressed by the contrast they saw between what they perceived as the decaying feudal society of contemporary India and the supposedly progressive capitalist society of Britain.
So their historical mission became this twofold endeavor. It wasn't just an academic critique. It was a deeply social and political project.
That's right. First, they felt they had to reform Indian society to match the standards of the West. And second, they had to reconstruct history to present an undeniable case for Indian capability and the right to self-government.
And while this entire movement was largely driven by a kind of Hindu revivalism, a desire to restore the glories of ancient India, it's crucial to note that the sources show there was still a strong parallel cohort of scholars who adopted a more rationalist and objective approach.
Exactly. They were using modern historical methodology to debunk colonial claims. So the intellectual ground was actually highly diverse. It wasn't monolithic.
Let's explore some of these key early rationalists and social reformers, the ones who tackled social issues head-on, using history as their weapon for change. Rajendra Lal Mitra is a prime example.
Mitra, who lived from 1822 to 1891, adopted a highly rational view. He published important Vedic texts and wrote the influential book Indo-Aryans.
And his work provided a fascinating and, I imagine, very forceful critique of contemporary religious orthodoxy using historical evidence.
Extremely forceful. He produced a tract showing that people in ancient times, and he cited textual evidence for this, actually ate beef.
That would have been incredibly controversial.
It was. And it was a clear, deliberate attempt to use history to challenge restrictive contemporary norms and show that current customs were often deviations from a more flexible past.
Other scholars directly challenged the colonial critique of India's social structures.
They did. They sought to prove that institutions like the caste system, at least in its original form, were not fundamentally unique in their rigidity. Some argued that the system was initially just a class system based on division of labor.
So not entirely dissimilar to ancient or pre-industrial class stratification you might find in Europe.
Exactly. They were trying to contextualize Indian society rather than allowing the British to simply condemn it as inherently stagnant and backward.
In Western India, especially in Maharashtra, we see scholars like Ramakrishna Gopal Bhandarkar emerge.
R.G. Bhandarkar, yes, lived from 1837 to 1925. He was a dedicated epigraphist and scholar who reconstructed the political history of the Satavahanas and provided definitive historical works on the evolution of Vaishnavism.
But the truly nationalist element of Bhandarkar's work was his commitment to social reform. This wasn't just ivory tower research.
No, it was active social campaigning backed by historical rigor. He used his historical research to advocate fiercely for widow remarriage and to castigate the evils of child marriage and the rigidity of the contemporary caste system.
His contemporary Vishwanath Kashnath Rajwade exemplifies the sheer physical dedication that was required for this nationalist project.
He really does. He literally journeyed from village to village across Maharashtra, often sleeping rough, just searching for and collecting original historical manuscripts. He ultimately published 22 volumes of Maratha history sources, an incredible effort.
And Rajwade's 1926 work, The History of the Institution of Marriage, is still considered a timeless classic.
It is. It's founded on solid textual evidence and offers deep scholarly insight into how the institution of marriage evolved across different historical eras in India.
And we really cannot discuss the foundational intellectual fortress built by these scholars without mentioning Pandurang Vaman Kane.
P.V. Kane, yes. His colossal work, History of the Dharmasastra, is just. It's encyclopedic. It filled 5 massive volumes published across much of the 20th century.
So for our listeners, it's probably essential to define what the Dharmasastra actually is.
Good point. These are texts that govern the entire spectrum of socio-religious duties, laws, and customs. They dictate everything from rituals and ethics to legal obligations and judicial proceedings. They cover all of life.
So because of their sheer scope, Kane's meticulous, detailed analysis of these ancient social laws was absolutely critical for understanding ancient societal organization.
Which is why his work is still indispensable for social historians today.
Okay, so let's move specifically to the nationalist effort to reclaim political history. They realized they needed to dismantle V.A. Smith's claim of eternal despotism.
It was the central pillar of the colonial argument, so they had to knock it down. They focused intensely on polity, on administration, on governance, to demonstrate that India had a long, sophisticated history of self-rule.
D.R. Bhandarkar, a renowned epigraphist, published important, well-sourced works on the political structures under Emperor Ashoka
and on the nuances of ancient Indian political institutions in general. He sought to prove complexity, where Smith had only seen uniformity and despotism.
Then there is Hemachandra Raichaudhuri. His historical reconstruction was vast in its scope.
It was. It spanned from the time of the Haratha War, which is the Mahabharata War, estimated around the 10th century BC, right up to the end of the Gupta Empire, concluding around the 6th century AD. He was known for impeccable scholarship and very meticulous textual handling.
However, the sources also critically note that Raichaudhuri showed a streak of militant Brahmanism. We should probably pause and unpack what that means in a scholarly context.
I think we have to. It speaks to the complex internal politics of the nationalist movement itself. In Raichaudhuri's case, this bias manifested in a couple of ways.
Okay.
First, an overemphasis on the superiority and purity of the Vedic and Brahmanical textual traditions. This often meant downplaying other regional or heterodox sources. Second, he was notably critical of Emperor Ashoka's policy of peace, known as Dhamma.
Why would he be critical of a policy of peace?
Because Ashoka's focus on ethical governance and nonviolence prioritized Buddhist and Jaina ideals over Brahmanical orthodoxy. Rajodhuri viewed this as a sign of political weakness, a deviation from the ideal of a strong, martial Hindu king.
I see. So this blend of nationalism and specific religious revivalism becomes even clearer with R.C. Majumdar.
Yes, who showed a much stronger element of Hindu revivalism. He was the prolific general editor of that massive multi-volume and truly foundational series, History and Culture of the Indian People.
The nationalist approach also strategically reframed political narratives, directly contrasting with Smith's colonial agenda.
It was a point-by-point refutation. So, in stark opposition to V.A. Smith, devoting nearly a third of his book to Alexander's invasion, Indian scholars minimized that focus significantly.
And instead, they stress the importance of indigenous resistance and accomplishment.
Exactly. They focus on the famous dialogue between Porus and Alexander, which elevates the status of the indigenous ruler. And more critically, they highlighted Chandragupta Maurya's subsequent liberation of northwestern India from Seleucus Nikacutor,
Framing him as a national hero who unified the subcontinent.
the first unifier. But this desire to glorify the indigenous past, it sometimes led to a common pitfall of nationalist history everywhere,
Which is?
overplaying the role of native dynasties against invaders. Scholars like K.P. Jaiswal and A.S. Altekar, for instance, sometimes overplayed the role of indigenous rulers against the Shakas and Kushans,
That's a key nuance. So they were reluctant to fully acknowledge the historical reality.
which was that Central Asian groups, while they were initially invaders, often assimilated. They became an intrinsic synthesizing part of India's social and political fabric, rather than just remaining foreign exploiters. Nationalist history sometimes required sharp lines where the cultural reality was much more blurred.
This brings us to K.P. Jaiswal's most profound contribution, directly confronting and exploding that myth of Indian despotism.
He made it his mission. His goal was to directly refute V.A. Smith's central claim that only autocracy had ever existed in India.
So how did he do it? How did Jaiswal manage to uncover systems of self-governance that colonial historians either ignored or actively suppressed? Was it a conscious deletion by Smith and his cohort?
It was partly suppression and partly just selective reading. Colonial historians read the text through the lens of European medieval monarchies, so they focused only on the kings. Jaiswal, armed with new methodologies, looked deeper. He looked into scattered textual references in epics, law books, Buddhist texts, to unearth the structures of governance below the centralized monarchies.
As early as 1910, 1912, Jaiswal was writing articles that eventually culminated in his landmark 1924 book, Hindu Polity.
And in it, he provided incontrovertible textual evidence, showing that numerous republics, known as Ganas or Sanghas, existed in ancient times, particularly in the pre-Mauryan and early Mauryan periods.
And they actively practiced forms of self-government.
Yes. This was a successful intellectual counterpunch that fundamentally undermined the colonial justification for despotic British rule.
Now, he was criticized for this, right?
He was. Jaiswal is sometimes charged with projecting modern nationalist ideas onto these ancient institutions, perhaps making them sound a bit more like modern parliaments than they actually were. But his basic thesis, that Republican experiments existed and were practiced, is widely accepted today. Hindu polity is still regarded as a foundational classic.
Finally, we should look briefly south. Early pan-India historical efforts, which were dominated by scholars working in North India, often neglected the history of the South.
A huge blind spot, and K.A. Nilakanta Sastry stepped in to rectify this.
His later work, A History of South India, is noted for its lucidity and its dependability on facts. But, just like Rajodhuri's work, Sastry's broad observations on the nature of South Indian society drew some critique.
They did. Specifically, he emphasized the cultural supremacy of the Brahmanas and highlighted a supposed harmony that prevailed in early South Indian society.
Observations which minimized internal conflicts and social stratification.
Right. And these observations were later challenged by scholars using Marxist or subaltern approaches who wanted to focus on economic exploitation and internal power struggles instead of cultural harmony.
So the overarching lesson of the nationalist approach is that history, in their hands, was forged into a weapon for liberation.
Whether their focus was on social reform, rationalism, or Hindu revivalism, the goal was always the same: to establish a glorious, capable past to justify a self-ruled future.
That nationalist project, necessary as it was for securing independence, often remained heavily focused on political history, kings, empires, administration, simply because that's what the colonialists had prioritized.
They were fighting on the same battlefield.
Exactly. But after independence in 1947, the field matured, and this led to a profound shift toward non-political history.
The need to constantly justify political legitimacy began to fade, and that created space for pure academic curiosity. The critique of political primacy, ironically, came first from British historian A.L. Basham.
Basham questioned the logic of continuing to look at ancient India exclusively through this narrow lens of modern political history.
Right. He was a dedicated Sanskritist whose earlier work had focused on the materialist philosophy of heterodox sex, so he was already inclined to look away from the orthodox dynastic narratives. His view was essentially that history should be read out of curiosity and pleasure, not solely as a weapon for political justification.
His 1951 book, The Wonder That Was India, became an academic landmark.
A huge landmark. It was a broad, sympathetic, and really engaging survey of Indian culture and civilization that deliberately moved away from the primacy of political events. And crucially, it was noted for being remarkably free from the anti-Indian prejudices of V.A. Smith and the other colonial writers.
So Basham successfully established that culture and daily life were just as deserving of historical attention as military campaigns or tax laws.
But the true seismic shift in methodology came with D.D. Kosambi. He introduced a theoretical framework that just redefined historical study on the subcontinent.
Kosambi blazed an entirely new trail by adopting a robust materialist interpretation of history, which he openly derived from the writings of Karl Marx.
This was a radical break from both the colonial and nationalist schools. Both of them had predominantly focused on textual or political narratives.
So if the focus shifts away from kings and texts, what does a materialist interpretation actually look at? How did Kosambi's methodology work in practice?
Kosambi brought the focus entirely down to the means and relations of production. He was looking at things like settlement patterns, pottery, land use, and how technological changes, like the transition from pastoralism to settled agriculture, affected social structures.
So for him, the political structure, the king, the state, was merely a superstructure.
Exactly, resting upon these fundamental economic processes. His key works, An Introduction to the Study of Indian History from 1957, and The More Accessible The Civilization of Ancient India from 1965, fundamentally changed the narrative.
And they presented society, economy, and culture as these integral dynamic components tied directly to the development of the forces and relations of production.
It was the first systematic survey to delineate stages of development in ancient India, not in terms of dynasties like Gupta or Maurya, but in terms of shifting tribal and class processes. It provided a structural, economic, and social explanation for change.
So he might link the rise of early urban centers to specific trade routes or agricultural surpluses, for example.
Precisely. Now, Kosambi was a controversial figure. He faced criticism even from contemporaries like Basham, but his methodology proved incredibly influential. It led to a profound sea change in how history was conducted over the next few decades.
Modern historical methodology today places far greater stress on social, economic, and cultural processes.
And it tries to relate them organically to political developments, rather than treating politics as the sole driver or the only narrative thread worth following.
And this shift required a change in evidence gathering. What's fascinating here is the introduction of truly interdisciplinary evidence.
Historians began to stratify texts, which means they assigned relative dates and reliability to different textual layers. And then they compared this conventional textual information with hard archaeological and anthropological evidence.
This professional methodology allows historians to triangulate.
It does. For example, if a late Vedic text describes a certain type of iron tool or crop, historians can now check the archaeological record for that period to see if it matches up. This cross-referencing builds a much richer, more layered and empirically grounded picture.
This is the hallmark of modern professionalism in the field.
It is. Yet, even as the old, blatant colonial biases fade, the sources point out that they evolve into something more insidious, what we might call sophisticated colonialism.
That's a powerful phrase.
It is. Western writers today, they no longer make the crude claim that all Indian culture came from outside. But some still emphasize divisive features like caste, religion, kinship, tradition as the central intractable forces that make for stagnation and immobility in Indian society.
Can you elaborate on this stagnation thesis? Why is this perspective considered a lingering colonial implication, even if the language is more academic and subtle?
The stagnation thesis argues that Indian society, because of its deep-seated cultural forces, specifically the caste system and pervasive religious tradition, has essentially not changed or cannot change meaningfully over millennia. It suggests that stagnation is an integral part of the Indian character itself.
That seems incredibly damaging. It implies a kind of cultural pessimism that justifies the slow pace of, or even resistance to, modernization.
It absolutely does. This narrative is used, whether it's intentional or not, to subtly prevent or critique India's contemporary progress. The underlying message is that any large-scale change will inevitably fail because of these deep-seated, intractable cultural forces that defy modernization.
It's an updated justification for structural pessimism. It replaces the old claim of you have no government with your culture prevents governance.
A very good way of putting it. And we should also note that a few Indian writers mirror this bias, but from the opposite extreme.
The flip side of the coin.
Exactly. The hyper-nationalist or revivalist historians who reject any notion of internal societal flaws. They magnify the role of religion, believing that everything good and great originated solely within their country, and they resist any recognition of external influence or the internal processes of exploitation or change that someone like Kosambi highlighted.
So if the move to non-political history was an academic broadening, this final approach we need to discuss represents a return to ideological warfare.
It really does. The sources are very clear on this. The struggle is no longer between colonialism and nationalism. Since the 1980s, the conflict has become one between communalism and irrationalism on the one hand, and rationalism and professionalism on the other.
The battlefield has fundamentally changed.
Yeah.
We now see a specific faction of Indian writers, sometimes supported by certain Western counterparts, adopting an aggressive and often irrational approach.
An approach that heavily identifies ancient India almost exclusively with a specific rigid definition of Hinduism, often termed Hindutva.
The core difference between this and the old nationalist school is critical to understand. The older nationalist scholars, like Jaiswal, they sought historical evidence to justify their political arguments.
They worked within the rules of history. But the current communal approach, however, often dismisses evidence entirely when it conflicts with faith or popular legend.
This leads to a number of specific arguments and historical distortions that professional historians have to contend with today.
The first and most critical is the overplaying of myths and legends over verifiable historical evidence.
For example,
they may argue for the literal historical existence of Ramasayodhya dating back millennia. They demand that archaeological data align with the narrative tradition, even when it fundamentally contradicts carbon dating or established stratigraphic layers.
another distortion is the active defense of social hierarchy.
Yes, and this is a stark contrast to the early nationalist reformers like R.G. Bhandarkar, who used history to campaign against child marriage and the evils of the caste system.
So what do communal historians do?
They actively censure any critical studies of the Brahmanical social structure and often implicitly or explicitly support the caste system in their narratives. They effectively ignore the deep social inequity and hardship that were stressed even by ancient lawgivers like Manu, who meticulously detailed the social stratification.
This is a clear reversal of the social reform goals of the early rationalist nationalists.
A complete reversal. A major theoretical shift is also the indigenous Aryan claim. For generations, historians and archaeologists, even many nationalists, looked outside India for the origins of the Vedic people. They often link them tentatively to movements associated with pottery types like the painted grayware found in northern India.
And now, this communal historical school categorically declares the Indo-Aryans to be entirely indigenous. No external migration, no influence.
This is a direct attempt to establish a deep, uninterrupted, and singular indigenous identity for the dominant religious group. And this indigenous claim is then used to formulate exclusionary generalizations about other groups who arrive later in history.
What are the implications of those exclusionary generalizations?
The argument is that Muslims and Christians, who arrived in later waves of history, are inherently foreigners. Regardless of their centuries of residence, cultural assimilation, or contribution to India's complex society, it's an ideological stance that rejects the cultural synthesis that even some of the more hardline previous nationalist scholars acknowledged.
The focus on terminology is also revealing. The current narrative is overwhelmingly centered on terms like Hindu and Hindutva.
And yet, as the sources explicitly point out, neither Hindu nor Hindu Dharma is known to any genuine ancient Sanskrit text or other ancient source.
That's a powerful historical nugget.
It is. The term Hindu originally came from outside India. It was derived from the Persian description of people living beyond the Indus River. The terms Hindu and Hindutva are modern constructs that are being projected backwards onto the ancient past to claim historical certainty for a contemporary political identity.
This raises a really important question for you, the listener, and for professional historians who are trying to navigate this landscape. In a climate of irrationalism, where myth is prioritized over evidence and political ideology dominates research, how must historians respond?
The answer is an uncompromising callback to the rigorous standards that were developed over the last century, particularly those championed by the non-political school. Historians who are wedded to objective and scientific criteria must be extremely alert.
So, adherence to the method.
Strict adherence to reason, verifiable textual analysis, and long-established archaeological standards when examining these new generalizations. The professional imperative is to resist the allure of politically convenient myths and constantly verify every claim against the empirical evidence, archaeological, textual, and anthropological.
The academic rigor introduced by scholars like Kosambi and Basham, the very methods that allowed the field to mature beyond simple political polemics, are the strongest defense against this new wave of irrationalism.
They're the only defense.
We've traveled through centuries of historical interpretation, seeing how the narrative of ancient India has been continuously leveraged. It was first a crucial administrative tool of the British Empire.
Then it became a weapon forged for Indian nationalism and the claim to self-rule.
Later, it matured into an academic quest for societal truth via material analysis, and now it's a ferocious battleground for cultural and religious identity.
The greatest takeaway for you, the learner, is the understanding that every systematic historical narrative, even the most meticulous one, serves a purpose.
We've seen the pendulum swing so violently from the colonial emphasis on foreign rule and Indian passivity
To the nationalist proof of indigenous genius and sophisticated administration. And critically, the move from purely political history to focusing on social and economic processes pioneered by scholars like Basham and Kosambi, that fundamentally changed our understanding of continuity versus stagnation.
It injected a critical materialist analysis into a field that had previously been dominated by simply listing kings and translating texts. The nationalist scholars like Jaiswal achieved a profound evidence-based victory over the ideological claim of colonial scholars like V.A. Smith. Jaiswal used meticulous textual analysis to prove ancient India had republics and systems of self-governance,
Directly contradicting the narrative of eternal autocracy, a huge intellectual win.
Now for the final provocative thought. If history is always written by the people who believe they are winning the cultural war, consider the current communal narratives. These aggressively prioritize myth, indigenous certainty, and religious exclusion.
In what way does this historical certainty, much like the certainties of V.A. Smith a century ago, reflect who believes they are winning the cultural debate today?
And what specific political ends might that historical victory be designed to serve in the present? Something profound to mull over until our next deep dive.